study. So again, just mentioned that descriptive ethics basically describes what a particular society believes to be good or bad, or right or wrong. Whereas at the normative level, normative ethics makes specific claims about way things should be, and they offer theories endorsing, not endorsing certain actions, belief, or feelings as good or right, and so on. Both descriptive and normative ethics are just distinguished from this another area of metaethics, which, as the name seems to already imply, is supposed to be a different level of uh, analysis or theorizing from even that of normative ethics. The word meta itself, coming from the Greek term meta, is typically used as a prefix. It comes before a word, meaning something more comprehensive or transcending particular or local phenomena. Let's take an example or an analogy, the distinction between physics on the one hand and metaphysics on the other hand. Now, for example, a physicist might want to know whether, let's say, Newton's second law of motion, F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, or the inverse square law, whether any of these accurately describe the behavior of objects around us. Metaphysics, on the other hand, is a branch of philosophy that examines more fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the relationship between mind and matter. Is there a mind independent reality, for example? The relationship between the substance of something and its features, and so on. In other words, metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that deals with what's often, going back to Aristotle, thought of as the first principles of things, and includes such abstract concepts of our being, uh, our knowing, how do we know what we know, our identity, concepts of time and space, and so on. So, whereas a metaphysician might want to know whether there is a mind independent reality that I mentioned, such that these laws, these physical laws, would hold even if we were not around to observe the world. In other words, this, let's say, F equals ma, would that be a true description of some rock falling from a cliff, even if humans weren't around to observe it and take evidence of it? So, to put it rather simply, uh, physicist deals with local phenomena, trying to give you theories of how they relate to each other, whereas a metaphysician will ask more fundamental questions about the very nature of reality, about very reality itself, and the nature of physics, and so on. So, when we transpose this analogy, let's say, to the ethical realm, a normative ethicist will ask questions such as which actions are right or which actions are wrong or which actions are good or bad. Whereas philosophers of metaethics will ask whether anything is really right or wrong, or whether there are really truths about morality, or some will claim there are no real truths about morality. So, a typical meta ethical question might inquire, as I said, whether there are moral truths, if stealing is wrong, or if murder is wrong, what would make that claim true? Now, that's a kind of a meta ethical question. The normative ethical question would be stealing is wrong, and then providing theories to make a convincing claim. The metaethical question is going to even ask is what would make such a claim true in the first place. So, in a sense, metaethical questions come in two parts. First, there's the sort of metaphysical question about what makes these claims true. What is the nature of morality, reality, or nature of our being that makes these moral claims true? That's what a meta ethicist would be interested in, this larger metaphysical question of the nature of our being, the nature of our reality that makes certain moral claims true or not true. And then there's, of course, a related epistemological question of how do we know these truths? If there are truths out there, let's say if we take the first part and say, yes, there are objective moral truths out there. The second question, or even objective physical truths out there. The second question is, how do we know those truths? Okay, or how do we get to know those truths? Now, one answer to the question of what makes a moral truth or moral claim true could be that there are moral facts out there. Just like the fact that that gulab jamun in front of you is syrupy and sweet, or that your friend's name is Ahmed, or that the color of your neighbor's car is red. These are all considered objective facts about the world that you can know somehow, prove somehow, through observing, through experimenting, and so on. So maybe there are similarly moral facts out there. And we want to know, well, what would that mean then? What are these moral facts like? So that's kind of what these are questions that metaethics has to answer before we can go to normative ethics, which will theorize about those moral facts. Similarly, another metaethical question you could ask, or one could ask, is what is a moral judgment? So that when you say something is right or wrong, good or bad, what does it even mean? Is it a belief-like state, just like we believe that the earth is a sphere? Is it a factual kind of claim? If we believe that stealing is wrong, is that similar to believing that the earth is flat? Or is there some fact out there that must correspond to it then? That my belief can accurately track and map. Let me rephrase that again. If we believe that stealing is wrong, is that similar to believing that the earth is flat or spherical? That we can go out there and track and map and prove? Can we do the same thing with the action of stealing? Can we go out there and find evidence or other ways to track the action, map it, and then come to a conclusion? Just like we would come to the conclusion if someone says the earth is flat, we can provide evidence, etc., and show that that is a wrong fact that they have proposed, and we would proceed to counter that. Are there ways we can do the same with moral facts? Can we make the claim that maybe there's knowledge out there somehow, that if we can put it together, we can come up with objective understanding or a comprehensive understanding of moral facts? Now, we will see very quickly that this is one kind of metaethical view, what is called moral realism. That there are objective knowledge out there that can allow us to arrive at moral facts. On the other hand, someone might say any moral judgment is not so much a factual matter, but an emotional state, such as disgust or horror. Maybe when we think of a horrifying act of murder or rape or torture, your response is more like disgust or a feeling like state rather than simply some logical belief or fact. So here the question then arises, what kind of mental state leads to moral judgment? Are our moral judgments arising out of belief or some logic or fact or some emotion? These are questions that once we get an understanding of different metaethical views on whether such questions can be answered, then we can move to normative ethics to look for such answers. We'll see some philosophers like David Hume who will trace our moral sentiments to emotions and feelings of empathy and so on. Others, like Immanuel Kant and others, will trace it to our use of reason. Just the same we use logic in math. well, same way we use logic or we do mathematics, that we can similarly reason out our morality. So these are different ways of approaching the question of moral judgments. Then there's also the question of language, we'll see. So when we have a moral judgment that we judge something is wrong, or something is good, or something is bad or evil, there's a separate question of the meaning behind those words. We'll see later in the course when we look at some criticisms of ethical theories and we turn to Nietzsche's work, we'll see that in his work, the meaning of the word good will shift as we shift when we compare good to bad, as opposed to comparing good to evil. So language itself also matters. What we consider good, what is the opposite of good? Is it bad or is it evil? Depending on which one we choose, that will also modify the meaning of good itself. Okay, let me stop here and we will spend a little bit of time making some quick distinctions between moral realism and moral relativism. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this here in the lecture, although in the classroom we'll go through some arguments in each of our sections to show why moral realists have to really put the questions raised by moral relativism to rest before one can move on to normative ethics. So, moral realism, as I just mentioned, is the view that there are moral truths out there that are objective and mind independent. It does not depend on your or my personal view, opinions, feelings, etc. Now, there are two kinds of moral realism, broadly speaking, that we will be encountering throughout this course. First can be called moral absolutism, the view that moral truths are absolute in the sense that there are no exceptions. That these moral truths hold regardless of certain different conditions, different persons, and so on. These can be contrasted to moral particularism, which the view there is that moral truths are determined by particular situations. And as I mentioned, we'll encounter examples and theories of both throughout this course. Now, we can just take a simple example of stealing to, make a sharp contrast between these two views. A moral absolutist would say, if we find that stealing is wrong, if stealing is wrong at all, then it is always wrong, regardless of the circumstances. You cannot justify it with this reason or that reason. If stealing is wrong, it's always wrong under all circumstances. A moral particularist might say, yes, sometimes it is really wrong to steal, but sometimes it is really right to steal, depending on the situation. I can take a quick example. Actually, we're going to come across examples later, so let me just keep moving on or actually make the key point here. Earlier, we started this distinctions within metaethics by making a distinction between moral realism and moral relativism. Within moral realism, we identified these two types of moral realism: moral absolutism and moral particularism. It's very important already to note now that moral particularism is not the same as moral relativism. Sometimes these arguments seem similar, and sometimes people will, attempt to use one in place of the other, and they're patently wrong when they do that. We will show this in class, and we'll continue focusing on this aspect of first looking at moral relativism, something that normative theorists are going to be doing all they can, come up with arguments to show why moral relativism does not hold, so that they can assume a moral realism that, as I mentioned, that there is objective truth out there, whether it applies to all circumstances, as an absolutist would say, or it applies in particular circumstances. There is a moral truth out there. As I mentioned, normative ethicists, people doing those who are theorizing normative ethics, need that metaethical foundation to build their theories on. That there is moral truth. There is so they need the moral realist perspective, and they will take pains to discredit the moral relativist perspective. So, as I just